Hello, how are you? How wonderful to share the language of music. It's a translation, but at the same time, it's an appropriation. It's the music of the past is our present. It was its own past when it was its own present, but perhaps they thought today we'll do the music of our day, like they did then. I find it fascinating to imagine that perhaps one can spend all one's life learning, thinking, imagining, studying how the piece was meant to be played, into these things in the notation that are beyond the hint or willingly left to the performer's freedom. On the other hand, it was in the tradition of the time, but since we're not in the time, perhaps we are misguessing it for the way we love it, even if it's perhaps the wrong way. Or is there a wrong way? The intent of the composer through the filter of the notation and our understanding with another instrument and ears of today, having heard styles of music since that day and incorporating them, perhaps mixing them, possibly compartmentalizing them. That will be helpful, but not always happening. In fact, the music of the past is our present, and in sense, what is incredibly compelling is that when you love, you want to know by curiosity, and therefore you get to love more what perhaps escapes you to understand. Now, perhaps that's what's appealing, to continue digging all life long, because there is something that reveals itself to you through life, in which you help to shortcut for the students when they discover it. And perhaps they should discover it in their own way, and they will reject some of the ways we think, at least with the experience that we gain, that's the way it's supposed to be. But thankfully, there is always a room for the moment where it becomes their own translation, interpretation, but then it becomes also this kind of ephemeral moment where we didn't know where we come from. We don't know where we go. People played it before, people played after. People study it, publish it, record it, compete with it, end up by making these pieces sort of like competition of sports style, when in fact it's all individual, intellectual, soulful, personal connection to the piece that has to grow with time, like a poem, a painting, a novel, film, or whichever art form that grows in your soul. And you feel sometimes that you're a guest of election of this, you're being part of this family, if it were, of these characters. And I find it fascinating to see how much the same piece can mean so many different things to so many different people, of whom some have definite opinions that is not supposed to be otherwise than their own way. Now, that is commendable. I don't consider it wrong. To the contrary, I think it establishes guidelines and routes for students to eventually contradict it, in part or in all. Life will take care of them choosing what they keep from what they receive, where they go to glean it. After all, the availability of performances today in comparison to the past is unbelievable. But ultimately, it's between yourself and how you can hear the piece. Like when you have your childhood ear that comes from your oral training of the language of your mother tongue. Then you start learning how to write it, how to think it, without to become certainly a writer, but you can develop your thinking. And therefore, I find that at some levels, music remains an individual connection through intuition, perhaps through emotion, through intellect that adds on top of it is something that satisfies our necessity to, if not understand, at least try to grasp where this melodic line leads. Why is it in minor, or how in minor? Is it really in 2 or in 4? And what is the group of bars for the pulse? And how do I find the right pace to bring me there? Length of sound, pedal, harmony, melody, polyphony, confusion or complication or blur, or clarity and then statement of connected sounds and decay compared to resonances and layered timbres of orchestral style or vocal singing, all suggested in a black and white kind of image on the piano of the color. Would it be orchestration or opera or choir? Music making through timbres of instruments with vowels and consonants and air for the wind instruments and the voice. All kinds of things the piano can hint, perhaps imitate, sometimes evoke, sometimes so strongly by the intention that you place in the narrative statement of what you received. Once you have the whole picture, if you can, of a given composer's output, from which this is a part of the puzzle, the piece you play. And it takes time to immerse yourself in the musical language, in the way this composer's expression evolves either instrumentally with the instrument, and how this means to your instrument today, and how you want to be closest to the essence, perhaps beyond even the instrument. But you cannot completely always separate and peel off the piece from its essence. It's part of it all. And while you can play it on original instruments, you also can accept to find a different way that means to you through the instrument that was not built for it when it was written. So is it intemporal? Is it so universal? Is the language of music? I think those are cliche words very often used, but there's some truth in it. That while we have to be so attentive, to be so rigorous, to know the meaning of every detail placed in its context, of the understanding of the composer's point of view of how they develop their thoughts, how they think the world through the music they express with or without lyrics. In a way, it talks to us directly through this evocation. And the piano is a very difficult instrument because, in a way, it's very easy access. You type. But then once you hear the instruments which inspire or which the keyboard piece is imitating, then you start finding ways to over legato, to find air legato, to find layered touches, articulations, subtleties, sophisticated voicings. And then it becomes a little bit of a individual endeavor of what do I bring and what I don't. I mean, it's like your own stage manager of a theater or opera play. So inevitably you have to decide that since the composer already chose a frame to keep certain things, interrupting silences with sounds in a way that is organized on the paper that you receive from the information, and then you put it back alive with your own miss or understanding. But I think it's very important to not stifle the intuitive understanding, even if possibly it will be tempered later by more knowledge and say, oh, I should have not, but perhaps this approach was too, but the rubato not enough, too much. But there are perhaps seasons in life for rubato as well. It's like patina on a sculpture. I find that all these things are very related in the imagery one builds of one's imaginary structure that we build ephemerally when we play the piano, where we can try not succeed always with one brain and 10 fingers and 2 feet with the pedals to suggest all these inner worlds which are in fact hinted to us through the piece, the way we read it. Of course, we're influenced by other performers. We're fans of some whom we admire, or we have teachers who teach us how to do the details, which is so important in artistry without technique. Fingering, phrasing, you have sometimes suspensions and appoggiaturas, and to understand how to make them with perhaps substitutions when you run out of fingers, because you have to find a way to connect it with finger legato so that you have clarity of the structure without the blur of all the dampers lifted. And then ultimately it's a question of how do you imagine the sound? Z, not one, because of the pulse, the phrasing, the rhythm. Sometimes you have triplets, sometimes not. Sometimes you have 2 against 3. In other words, if you take them layer by layer, the complexities, and at the end you just present it as a finished, cooked, so to say, product, then the taste buds of the listeners can perhaps detect here and there more or less some ingredient or another and say it's too fast, not enough, or should be more this, and no ritenuto there, and this transition that. And everybody has an opinion once they have knowledge of the piece as listeners, as performers, listeners. So then it becomes like a permanent jury. And on the other hand, there is the moment where the people discover it as they like to be told a story since childhood. And then perhaps they can reject it and say, I don't like this length, or I don't like these recapitulations or this repeat. And what's the purpose anyway of a formal recapitulation? If the statement is done once, it's good. But in fact, it has its purpose also. It could be a redundancy for tenderness, or perhaps an insistence, or just a structural need to suggest to the listener some kind of imaginary GPS. You know, friend, we discover this piece and we know where we are more or less because we recognize thematic materials that come back more or less systematically. Now, perhaps it is also a time period where, when things go faster, people get always more impatient. And probably it was in each time period, like when you look at the records of sports events from the 20s of the 20th century and today, they run like children today. But for the time, it must have been amazing, just like the dissonances that were so provocative in Monteverdi became so natural to us that they not even appear to be so. But then progressively, other dissonances become consonances of tomorrow. So is it that we get adjusted to it, or is it that we want to accept it as it is? And if we don't like it, as my teacher said when I was sight reading pieces, commenting them with my, of course, unawareness of what I was saying, but nevertheless, she said, if you don't like it, how he wrote it or she wrote it, write your own. But if you play theirs, then make sure you play the closest to what you think they wrote. Regardless if my intuition doesn't match. Who am I? Nothing. The composer is all. I'm serving the composer. Not as a recitant, perhaps a re-narrator and a litterateur. And I think it's very necessary to involve oneself in this after the framing of the composer who chose to extract from all the universe these few sounds to suggest this kind of universes of inner worlds. Then as a performer, either you match it, either you enhance it. If you want to say in your playing that it's so meaningful to you, perhaps you overstate it in the eyes of some and you just state it rightly in the eyes of others. But it's in the eye of the beholder when it's an exaggeration compared to when it's a hint, compared to when it's right. And who defines this? Who is the judge of the good taste? Experience or lineage of performers whom you admire and you say, oh, Chopin only by such and Brahms only the way of this person, or, yes, this is our inner pantheon. And then you hear somebody new come and you realize that the piece reveals itself anew. And then, of course, the separation between interpretation and piece is relatively recent. Publishing schools, um, multiplied competitions, and in fact, nobody asked, therefore, a composer who would play, let's say, Mozart or Beethoven or Chopin, to play something from a predecessor of theirs. It was understood that Mozart will never be asked to play the Goldberg variations. If he's invited in a salon, he plays Mozart, regardless if it's improvised or later written after an improvised moment. But it was, in fact, not possible to define if Beethoven did the right interpretation of his piece, since it was from the producer to the consumer directly, so to say. So, with later awareness, like for Ravel, who didn't practice much his music that was so sophisticated, complex for the piano writing, he insisted to play it himself. And some reviewers in America in the 20s during a tour said how ironic that such a beautiful music is played by the composer not so beautifully, which then started becoming a fact that the interpretation in the oeuvre, or the composer's work, and even by the composer, started becoming split. And of course, you have then most and more performers who don't compose, and more composers who don't perform. Regardless if it's by choice, ability, education, or just the fact that in the system of schooling with the years and the competitivity that is given to go through the regular time to develop, perhaps we need more individually or less according to another, not everybody blooms before 33 like Mendelssohn or Mozart in music. That's of course exceptional. Perhaps they're already ready to bloom as they did very early. But on the other hand, because of the competitivity and the ages, there's a lot of pressure on the young students to quote unquote mature quickly in their interpretation. So, of course, you relate more to articles and editions and the teacher's opinion, and perhaps many teachers' opinions. And so ultimately, I don't know how much the accumulation of all this learning results in the artist student. I think it's more the intuition from the get-go that guides them through and peels the orange, as my teacher used to speak about me, and perhaps in a way, in a figurative way, they already know what they want. They just want to either get reassured, either to be reassured what they want to reject. And Mademoiselle Boulanger, therefore, when I arrived to study with her as a child, the first thing she told me is, don't say you don't like a piece or you don't love a piece. Say you don't understand the piece and you'll try to love it again, perhaps later in life. Sometimes you acquire tastes, as you do. Not all pieces are intuitively connected, or in which you can connect to. Perhaps you can, perhaps you can't, perhaps you understand them the wrong way or love them for the wrong reasons. That's a kind of philosopher's play on all these elements. But factually, she really meant to say, keep trying to understand it. Perhaps you will love it. And if you don't love it, don't reject it. It takes a lot of humility to accept that, just like a musical language of a composer, even if they use the same notes and possibly the same tonal system with changing styles between classical, romantic, and probably for them, in their lifespans and their early blooming and their short lives for most of them, with the exceptions of few, like Rossini, Verdi, not to mention Haydn even earlier. I think there was a sense of longing to express oneself for the sake of what is part of humanity in it, not just frame it in a sonata or a fugue or then an aria or a dance. In other words, you either imitate other genres, either you organize music just for itself, like sonata or fugue, or as a form. And of course, the purpose of it, sacred or secular or entertaining, or perhaps a little bit combination of an aria of Mozart in an opera compared to a mass is very similar in its structure, in fact. Just like Bach's choral vocal aria writing is as instrumental chromatically and breathless as the instrumental parts which go with it. So perhaps we try to organize in our learning of these genres and styles and framing how we can define them and fit them in neat boxes for our understanding and teaching. Feels always like as if there are many things in the art form that don't fit our logical organization. They need to, they don't belong to this genre, a little bit to that genre. When Lully came with an opera from the theater plays at the Louis XIV court, or Beethoven writing a symphony with choir, which is really a little bit more than, but not completely a choral piece, but symphonic piece. Is it an oratorio? Some people don't stay within what we expect them to be. And I think that our privilege is to study so much, and probably their loss was that they had very little access in their own time of their own past. They would have been fascinated. Perhaps to a certain point, they might have not even produced if they thought, oh my God, if I knew all this was written. Because sometimes that also is a difficult thing when you teach students, to try not to overwhelm them so they can still find their own self-esteem of what's the purpose of their destiny in music in terms of how they play the piece, or how they compose their own piece, or how they transcribe the piece, or how they make the interpretation of the piece. All these elements of music making, very important to nurture, to teach, to open horizons, to free thinking, and the same time give rigorous know-hows about being reliable on stage so that you can express freely the meaning of every line, every phrase, every subphrase, every secondary line, and how you manage to follow them, anticipate them, structure them, and then bring them to fruition during this ephemeral performance moment which vanishes as soon as you played. And I find that to be very important, because ultimately the students come to study because they already love the music, and perhaps not very clearly how and not very clearly why, but it means so much to them that they take incredible life choices to pursue that call it, or whatever it is, fascination, regardless that it's not rational, or perhaps because it's not rational. In a rational world, or, well, when was it not? You visit museums of artworks of times past, and you study in history books about wars and treatises after each war, and how everything is about possessing this and taking that, and this dynasty and this territory and this empire, and then it all goes down to shambles and again. Perhaps it's in human nature, but in any case, there are some things intangible that humans want to express since they started painting in the grottos. in prehistoric times. Some need to, is it immortality of the soul? Is it some kind of a desire to always go beyond finitude's awareness? I don't know. Perhaps ultimately life is this beautiful tramway from which we drop for a few stations and then we rejoin it, and we don't know where it came from, where it goes. But the journey is certainly exciting with the people we meet, with whom we receive so much of their own, and sometimes negative, mostly positive, regardless. It's better to always allow this journey with music to be like a partnership with the pieces. No matter how much you think you have built with the decades certain answers to the questions of how and how much and not enough of what in each interpretation, to always remain open through the students or even by yourself when you revisit the piece. It's easy to say, difficult to do. As they say, don't do what I say. It's leading by example for a teacher is to be very humble, because you have to accept that no matter what, perhaps if ever there was this science fictional moment to meet the composer whom you love to serve all your life in different ways, and you realize that in fact perhaps it wasn't the way, but you loved it so much and you believed in it, and you wrote articles and books and recordings and convictions, and beautiful. I think that's what's most meaningful, and people love it and perhaps people reject it, but it creates a sense of sharing something intemporal, which is so meaningful, even if it's an ephemeral passing moment. Sometimes I dream we could hear back from the composers when we question them. What did you want? How did you want it? Is grace not this way? Or is not supposed to be on the beat, before the beat, measured, unmeasured? How unmeasured? Why is it notated unmeasured when the rest is? It's very tempting to make this dialogue with oneself when, as a partner, you have a score and you're deciphering it like you're deciphering some ancient scrolls. And on the other hand, no matter what you're told, you end up making your own choices. And I respect that so much. So the students are not some kind of clones of your own aesthetic opinion or your own lineage as a, let's say, disciple of a famous teacher in turn for the students to follow, but they reject or compare and prefer other ways or partly. And I find that this is very rewarding for me when I see them accomplish themselves in such a different directions. Like, in a way, my teacher used to reveal students to themselves who had great driven necessity to express themselves in an art form, regardless if when they were her students they didn't know exactly how to. And is it technique? Is it hint that it's meaningful and give them enough self-esteem to develop more? I think she revealed them to themselves very differently from whom she was musically herself grown to become. And that is very rare. And I'm so moved when I see students of mine accomplish themselves in such a different ways, in different genres of music or any other way, or even in the same, but in their own way. Ultimately, admiration is so important. You cannot tell it to the student because it's then pedagogically wrong. But you can hint it to them by expecting a lot from them. And they would feel like if you do is that you believe they can. And that, I think, is a very powerful pedagogical passing of the torch. Not to discourage, not to completely, constantly try to only encourage at any price, to find the right balance between rigorousness and excitement in the pure sense of the word, the aha moment by themselves. And ultimately, I always feel like a hyphen between my teacher and my students, between my parents and my children. And that is a common expression to understand in the chain of the generations, regardless how much of our awareness of transmission, of values, of a sense of aesthetics, and what they do with it is different from what I managed to do with it, perhaps. But ultimately, what matters is that sometimes, as I feel, I wish some of my students studied with my teacher directly, if that was chronologically possible. Of course, it's not. And I don't pretend anything other than to be a hyphen, a bridge. As I like to say, the most important in the sonata form is the quality of the transitions, not only the thematic materials, which are the obvious. And those well done details blend in with elegance and a sense of dignity, and then refreshingly returning to another section that reminds you of the preceding theme. After the struggle in the development, as if there is room for every approach to the sonata form. The how beautiful, or oh, how interesting, or oh, I didn't imagine that was in fact the second theme mirroring the first. As if there is so much at so many levels to be. It's like you watch a painting and you just see something, and then you have an art historian next to you telling you so many hints that are suggested in the painting, and you all of a sudden say at some point, okay, let me just enjoy it for what it is. But something stays within from what you learned as well, regardless if you asked for it. That's why analysis is a way to not supplant the intuition. It's perhaps a way to vindicate that intuition, or then learn how to play counterintuitive if you want to bring a sentence to another level, dimension, direction, distance of phrasing than the obvious. And the obvious is right as well as sometimes contradicting it. That's why it's beautiful to work on it, because in a way, every lesson is a laboratory. You don't have answers, you only develop the questions, you crystallize the questions. And then you go back to the practice and go over and over and over and over until you find the moment where you think you almost touched it, or managed to more or less, if not control it, at least shape it, sculpt it. And then, because it's ephemeral, unlike a painting that remains painted, every time you replay it, you start from scratch. So it's sometimes discouraging, to say not most of the time. But you develop a sense of yearning towards an ideal. And if you apply enough of the wisdom technique that you're taught, you might reach this moment where you in fact explore it and reveal it to others, like you reveal it to yourself, like you reveal yourself to yourself. Not just, oh, it's such a difficult piece, I wish I could do it, now I can do it. And then what do you do with it? How do you bring it to the others? It's not all about philosophy, because the analysis gives you more the skeleton than the soul. The soul comes with the intuition, but you need both to understand anatomy for the body, and as well as the soul through the spiritual experience that we all carry in us. With different levels of awareness, regardless of faith or not. But music is also a hyphen between us and these otherworldly moments. Call it daydream or contemplative, of course, active. But sometimes you feel like, as a performer, you let the music itself speak to you, the instruments speak to you. So it's like the horseman and the horse, the actor and the part. Um, there is a osmosis that at some point becomes so meaningful that you don't see which is when, where starts what. It's like as if you become the extension of the instrument or of the phrase or of the line, with the acoustic for the resonance, with the breath, with the decay of the sound, the pedal, you you create things which already exist for those that are written, and perhaps if you want to dig them from inside out from yourself, they will be reminiscent of others, and that is fine, because we are part of where we come from, consciously or subconsciously. And I think that it's important that the sum of knowledge doesn't shut down the intuitive, creative writing or interpreting. Because the more you work on becoming really very sharp in the knowledge and the know-how of your trade, the more you realize that it's a bottomless pit. It's only others who observe you who can tell you, you know, lately I think you've reached something there in this piece. The inner voice, this breath, this little rubato, just enough to bring us to this modulation. And perhaps they won't be able to verbalize it so, and that's fine. But if it's missing, they will not know what they miss, but they'll find it perhaps not very appealing. Perhaps sometimes the charisma of the performer is more meaningful than the analysis and knowledge of it. And sometimes the instrument, the voice, the organ of one's inspiration transcends all this necessity of detailed knowledge, which it would be more scholarly, but it can be applied in real time on the music. Like you can write harmony on paper to learn how to organize the equals in a society like polyphony used to be. In the beginning of polyphony, without secondary voices. And then you can do it on the piano, on the keyboard, or harpsichord after, and then into piano, where you apply the harmonic voice leading in real time through keyboard harmony. Okay, it demands faster brain connections of voice leadings, but nevertheless, that's like chess players do, or perhaps crossword puzzle writers do. You imagine all these universes like a blueprint in your mind as an architect. And you visualize it in 3D in front of your eyes, just like you hear it in your ear, even if it's not yet composed. And what comes out of it in the notation might or not betray it or belittle it. Same with the interpretation. You're ready to start the piece. You almost project yourself through the piece that you know how to go through, and then others, how many times you've practiced through it. But then it reveals itself a certain way the day you play it in front of an audience, more or less intended. For some sections, well, but that's also what we have to accept with that ephemeral art. You don't repaint the paintings after the gallery closes for the next day, but for the piano playing, it's as soon as done, gone. And the more you try to capture this evasive moment that is so meaningful, like this soulful moment, which you cannot capture, like the ancient Greeks mentioned that the soul is psyche, the breath, which is the ultimate thing that evaporates when you die. I think this is perhaps the flame towards which we all are attracted to go to, either when you fall in love or when you are curious by incredible sense of amazement of what is this form of art, way of thinking, type of language. I think it's the fragility, contradictory, obvious facts of the human race. And that is so beautiful and meaningful. That we have a heart and a soul and a spirit. Well, perhaps it's in the soul, regardless where the soul is. And that it's so meaningful that we want to spend our life trying to do it better, to serve it right, which on the side looks a little bit ephemeral and at least possibly also superficial or self-indulging or perhaps narcissistic. Regardless, there's something in the gesture of a phrase in music, like in painting, in sculpture, in a edit of a film, of a sequence, where you're immersed in another dimension for a given moment, and it makes you travel in places where you don't know why and how. Perhaps you do more or less, you can be more or less aware, but ultimately it's not so important. What's important is to be there. Is it escapism for the sake of it? Sometimes. Most of the time, perhaps, even to be honest. Within the time in which we are. It's fascinating to live with the present in the past, which had its own presence. So is it timeless? I don't know. Perhaps some music genres and styles will go out of fashion for the generations to come. Perhaps others will appear more important, and perhaps some were unfairly forgotten by history or put away as not important or not meaningful. Do we have enough of a lifetime to be able to have gone through all the repertoires to choose then and start making our own hierarchy? Obviously not. So we start with a sort of preset playlist of important things we're supposed to study, learn, like we do in school. And then after that, we develop affinities and we develop during that time even, or perhaps we acquire taste for things we didn't even imagine before, and it becomes a second nature, as intuitive as if it would have been in the first place. Then you travel from other countries with other cultures, with other music elements in the ear, and why leading tone, why tension release, why not? Why not just have statements without restatements? Why not have popular music that restates a lot just because it's mood setting, it's pulse for the dancing? It's part of the human experience. You have impulses, you have moments of contemplation, you have yearnings, and then you have also necessity of something very earthy. It's not either or, it's all of the above. Difficult to accept, but is essential. That beautiful contradiction of being human. So easy to criticize, this is cruel, this is competitive, this is weak, this is naive, this is, yes, that is the structure of society that organizes you and is not made for some people who cannot fight and others who are not fighters. And then I'm not saying anything idealized should exist. I'm just saying that, as I mentioned earlier, polyphony helps a lot to see that it's possible to have a society or micro society of equals. And it was already written when very little of it existed in society as a right. So perhaps it's a human yearning, expressing itself through different forms, a gesture of a dancer, a production of the sound of a violinist. Yes, the technique calls for the gesture, and the gesture becomes then the playfulness of it, as we like to call it, playful. Because to a certain extent, the ergonomic aspect of even if it's difficult and sometimes most of the time frustrating because we cannot grasp it fully, either intellectually, either muscular memory wise, or whatever, control of our breath and all that, for the expression of the music that we want to serve or imagine or reimagine. It comes always down to that. We are here to experience, and if we can stay humble, least judgmental possible, truly tolerant, without to be accepting anything other than what we believe is right, even if we can change mind in terms of aesthetics, we have to give grounds to the students from which they develop themselves, but we don't want to remain rigid either. After all, every day is different in our mood, in our temperament, the way we hear music, the way the music is tuned, the way the music is expressed, with or without perfect pitch, with acquired and learned perhaps parallel intervals, pitch of hearing the spaces rather than the notes themselves. After all, since it's a language, you feel like music is speaking to you, even without only lyrics. And I think that it's humbling and inspiring to help shape and sharpen these taste buds in the students who seek for it by perhaps already knowing what they want. It's a beautiful exchange between them as students and me as teacher, as it's a beautiful exchange between them and me with the composer whom we serve in the lesson to try to define better or meaningful, or how to organize it, how to structure it, why it goes there and how it to go there and how to bring it, and how to frame it to a certain point without to be rigid. Thank you. Thank you very much.